Thank you. Welcome back for our closing keynote with Amy Collier. Just a few announcements before we begin. I would like to thank our platinum sponsors, iClicker and Laserfiche, our gold sponsors, CDWG, Dell Security, and Insight Systems Exchange, and our sponsors Top Hat, Chalk and Wire, Team Dynamics, and Government Connections for sponsoring the generous $20,000 technology prize giveaway. We could not have held this conference without their dedicated support. Dr. Amy Collier is the Associate Provost for Digital Learning at Middlebury College. At Middlebury, Amy provides strategic vision and leadership for the implementation of technologies that will position the college as a leading innovator in creating and sustaining a global learning community. Previously, she was the Director of Digital Learning Initiatives at Stanford University. Please welcome Dr. Amy Collier.
Hello. Hello. Congratulations, survivors of Campus Technology 2016. You did it? You're here? I'm kidding, you still have one more hour with me right now. So since our numbers are dwindling, right, you're gonna have to really guffaw for me when I let loose a joke, which is rare. I'm not a funny person. But when I do, I expect guffaws, okay? All right. Oh, thank you. All right. Are we going slides? All right, excellent. So just real quickly, if you are tweeting, that's my username, and that's the hashtag for the conference. So please tweet all of my pearls of wisdom. There will be one, maybe two. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about my campus technology experience, not this year, but from the past. So many of you in the room probably don't know me because I haven't actually been to this conference in 9 years. And I know we actually start to get to know people who attend the same conferences as we do. We start to get to know people in our networks. And I haven't been to this conference in 9 years. 9 years ago, at Campus Technology in Washington, DC, I was a PhD doing a poster session on embedding audio and video in PDF to give students feedback on their work. That was 9 years ago. And, you know, I think about the last 9 years, and a lot has changed, and so many things haven't changed. And in some ways, I'm comforted by the fact that some of the same tensions that we were dealing with 9 years ago at that Campus Technology are some of the same tensions that we're dealing with today. And I think we should embrace those tensions in our work. I think once we get to the point where we've got all the solutions, we've got all the answers to the uses of technology in our work, I think we've probably missed the boat. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk a little bit about some of the tensions that are still around and that they're ones that we really should embrace. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about risk. So what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the word risk or when you hear the word risk? Oh, yeah, but like, just go ahead and yell. Go for it. Benefit. Benefit. Ooh. Hey. Troublemaker.
Spoken like a true lawyer.
Oh boy, this is going to be a fun crowd. All right. So for those of you who hadn't had a chance to yell out, turn to someone close to you. I like how some of you have claimed like whole tables for yourselves. Yell to the other table if you can. What do you think of when you think of the word risk? I want to hear some noise to each other. Calculation.
Trump, yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah. We're not going there. All right. Well, we don't have time to hear everyone's responses. I really wish we could because I think some of you have some really interesting responses. But if we did hear everybody's responses, I imagine we'd hear a range of views, and even some of the ones that I heard yelled Trump are interesting and different. As I talk a little bit about risk today, please bear in mind, I don't take it lightly. I don't take it glibly. deeply personal experience. Risk can be felt differently by each person in the room. Risk can sometimes mean for some people irrevocable danger, irretrievable loss. Is risk bad? Not always. Some of us might talk about risks as the chance to gain something, to find something new, possible benefit, as Gardner yelled out. Some of us might talk about the risk of, I don't know, falling in love, being in love, loving someone. The same could be said, I think, about risk in education. Risk in education is not a uniformly felt thing. It's not categorically good or bad. It could mean a risk of irretrievable loss. It could mean the willingness to risk something to gain something. It could be that you put at risk your stability, your frames of reference, your ways of knowing, and to look toward what it means to become educated. That was me in graduate school. I was a non-traditional student, starting a family, working full-time, going to school full-time. I felt like I risked a lot, but I felt like I did it because I believed I could do better things in the world with my education. And that's the key point about risk. Risk happens when there's something at stake. When you care about the welfare of something or someone enough to worry and to have the potential for its loss. Risk happens when there's something to lose. But here's the thing. I'm observing, and I think a lot of people are observing, a trend in education to minimize risks, to make education a risk-free proposition, at least in terms of its outcomes and its quote-unquote value. Risk of education is one that you might walk up for. Risk in education is that you'll be transformed. Risk in education is that you might find a voice and the risk that comes with having that voice. A risk in education could be a powerful force subverting dominant paradigms and hegemonies. Risk in education is liberation. That's liberal education. And this risk, this liberal education, little L, thank you, Steve. Liberal education is being squeezed out. So an example of this, something that I've been watching over the last few years, is this evidence and accountability movement that we're seeing in education. It's been taking hold of education for the last couple of decades. The evidence-based education movement presses that the only education that's worth anything is what can be rigorously measured and accounted for. No risk involved. Maggie McClure calls the push for evidence-based education and research animated by a desire for certainty, willing to sacrifice complexity and diversity for harder evidence, and a global tournament of standards. The evidence-based movement has a deep political, economic, and cultural background. We don't have time to go into it today, but if it's a minute, you must look it up. It's fascinating. And some of the references I have today will go deeper into that if you find them. But the point I want to get to today is there are ways in which the evidence movement signals an intolerance for risk in education. To make evidence a beacon for how we understand education, we end up relying on narrow models of objectivity and impact. We end up limiting what counts as education. We limit the risk of education. As Ken Morrison says, the evidence-based education movement pushes researchers and teachers to analyze phenomena and measurable variables, and then to focus only on certain of these, which is to miss the synergies and significance of the whole. What gets missed? We refuse to acknowledge what is not eminently measurable. It reduces education to an act of schooling, and I emphasize act as a form of activity. Schooling devoid of risk in education. Geert Biesta takes us a bit further in his book, The Beautiful Risk of Education, which is a chewy read, but one that's really worth reading if you can make it through. So he takes it a step further and he talks about the learnification of education. Biesta points to the Barr and Tag article that came out in, I think it was 1994, maybe, from Teaching to Learning, a New Paradigm for Education, where the authors talk about shifting from an instructivist model to a constructivist model, a learner-centered model. These are all pretty familiar terms, I think, to many of us by now, because learnification has taken hold. Biesta says, since then, the language of education has been learning. It's education has been learnified. One of the concerns that he and I both share about this learnification of education is that it's really hard to question. Of course, we want learning in education. Of course, that's a part of it. But that's not all there is. How can we push back on the learnification of education? You often get angry tweets when you talk about it, by the way. Biesa says that his fight isn't with learning per se, but it's the way we use learning, tossing it about and making it the focus of everything we do. Our focus on learning has narrowed what we mean by education, because we try to strict and measurable parameters on what we mean by learning, and that strips away content and context and purpose and relationships. Learnification has a way of decomplexifying what we mean when we say education, and thus has the potential value, thus what the potential value of education can be in society. I'll quote Biesa as learnification recrafts education within the terms of an economic transaction. That is, a transaction in which, one, the learner is the potential customer who has certain needs, in which, two, the teacher, the educator, or the educational institution becomes the provider. And three, where education itself becomes a commodity to be provided or delivered by the teacher or educational institution and to be consumed by the learner. It's the ultimate banking model of education, as to use Paulo Freire's words. Learner as consumer then becomes a way we talk about education. So the three concerns here are, one, it changes the people for whom education is intended. Biesa talks about the notion of when we focus on learning only, we take away the for whom and the for what of education. Learnification treats them as consumers, ignoring their social and cultural and political contexts. There's an excellent podcast out there called Future Forward. I highly recommend you listen to it. There's an episode about the future of education where she talks about, it's called Bot for Teacher. Yeah, like hot for teacher, bot for teacher. And one of them, in that podcast, one of the interviewees says, you know, one of the problems with the way we are implementing technology, and I would say this is a function of learnification, is that we don't realize that when students come to learn, they aren't just coming in as a learner. They're coming in as a human. And many of the students are facing challenges that make it so they don't have space to be curious about the things the algorithms are trying to measure. Go listen to that podcast. We'll get to the role of technology a little bit later in this talk too. Two, learnification devalues teacher. It offers simplicity and tidiness and risk-freeness, and the idea that instruction can be made better by assembling and deploying content and techniques and approaches endorsed by unproblematic evidence. Arguing in favor of the movement, Popham said, it simplifies teaching so that, quote, once teachers have a fix on what their students are supposed to learn, almost all subsequent decisions will revolve around how those students ought to learn it. The focus on evidence condenses instruction to a series of decisions, largely devoid of professional judgment and empathy. These things can have the effect of eroding faculty morale and devaluing the teacher. How many of you have heard about the idea of technology eventually replacing the teacher? It comes a lot from this learnification. And have you ever heard people complain that faculty are resistant to the change that you're bringing to them? Ever think that maybe one of the reasons why is because some of the changes we're proposing completely devalue the role that they play? Could it be that our lack of understanding of the complexity of faculty life and roles could make them wary of the solutions that we provide? And third, learnification also has been a way we've imposed certain ways of thinking about the future and change. As the amazing Audrey Waters said in a recent keynote, we're constantly being told the narrative of the world is changing fast. So we need learners to change fast. We need our institutions to change fast. Learning is adaptation, even if it's not totally clear what we're adapting to. Even if it's not totally clear, we know where we're changing, what we're moving toward. I love Stephen's talk yesterday about the notion of those poles. What are the values that we're actually being pulled to? we're just being pushed by the drivers, or where are we going exactly? So I think a really good example of learnification in higher education is the push for learning outcomes. Now, before you tweet that I am anti-learning outcomes, hang on. Too late. Too late. Always. It's always. Every time I talk about learning outcomes, somebody tweets that I hate learning outcomes. I'm sorry, it's not true. So my concern with learning outcomes is the rigid way that they're implemented, mechanistically produced. I have actually seen, I don't know if you guys, it's been a long time since I've seen one of these, but there are tools out there that you pretty much just plug in some verbs and it generates the learning outcomes for you. This concerns me a little bit. Don't worry, if you put in the right Bloom-approved verbs, it doesn't kick you out. You know, rather than learning outcomes being a helpful way for us to think about our relationship to learning and our students' relationship to learning, learning outcomes have become a way to justify education against certain outcomes. The evidence and learnification movement have had the unfortunate effect of narrowing our views of what education is, ignoring all kinds of different possibilities for education, and narrowing our views of what counts as education. The push for what works, as my colleague Jen Ross and her colleagues at University of Edinburgh have said in their manifesto for online teaching, which I highly recommend, learning outcomes have had a totalizing effect, which ignores the idea that there are many ways to get it right in education, and many unpredictable outcomes to education that don't fit nicely with Bloom. And I love that I get to quote Gardner Campbell when he's in the room, for goodness sake. I will actually reference him quite heavily today, so Gardner. So Gardner writes, you know, these learning outcomes are still just behaviors specified with a set of what I can only describe as Yahoo statements. I actually had to look up how to say Yahoo. I hope I'm saying it right. Which means, yes, sir. All rewarding the bon élèves and marching toward compliance and away from more elusive and disruptive concepts like curiosity and wonder. In another article on networked learning, Gardner writes, even as student-centered learning becomes the mantra, the increased attention to outcomes and objectives served and still serves to enable a narrowing behaviorist focus on easily measured, easily described outcomes linked to detailed prescriptions, policies, and penalties, all contained within the course contracts, i.e. the syllabus. So I warned some people earlier, I'm gonna go on a little bit of tangent. I have no idea if this is actually gonna connect. It's just something that's in my brain right now and we're just gonna run with it. I feel like one of the things that I've been seeing in the news lately about Sesame Street captures the effect of learnification and the transactional banking model of education in such an interesting way. I don't know if you've seen, has anyone seen what's going on with Sesame Street?
Rump is coming.
Rump.
You haven't heard that?
No, I don't know about Rump. But a couple of weeks ago, 3 beloved human characters, longtime Sesame Street actors, were fired by Sesame Street Workshop and its new partner, HBO, to try to usher in a new relevant version of Sesame Street. Now, the word relevance gets tossed around a lot with learnification. Anything within the learning proposition in education gets assessed based on its relevance, rather than say it's transformational or liberatory or political power. So I had an exchange with a colleague of mine, Rollin Moe, on Twitter. Rollin is fantastic. If you're on Twitter, you should follow him. And we talked a little bit about how the Sesame Street of olden days, my Sesame Street, it was a show that was for children who could not attend preschools. It was a show for children who were in under-resourced neighborhoods. And one of the reasons for the human characters was to show children from under-resourced backgrounds that their neighborhoods might have allies and mentors and educators that they could turn to for guidance. It was a show about empowering children of these neighborhoods to see themselves and the people around them represented. In a neighborhood, these are the people in your neighborhood is not an arbitrary statement. In a neighborhood where people work together, resolved conflict, and participated in a community. Now, not only will Sesame Street play on a channel that children from under-resourced backgrounds actually cannot afford, but we also lose that community aspect. Now we just have more Elmo with a tablet. But don't worry, I'm sure they'll have really good learning outcomes for the show. Thank you. So in the fight to perform a version of education that people will see as valuable, that can be measured against subjective checklists of value, we have stripped away the things that truly make it valuable. Democratic participation, resistance to claimed authority, resistance to rulers, voice, the role of having a voice, civic leadership, rejection of hegemonies. We have taken the risk out of education. We've turned it into learning as a performance, a show of checking off boxes, competencies, outcomes. Biesa says, the call to make education strong, secure, predictable, and risk-free is an expression of impatient times, but it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what education is about, a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes education, quote, work. It sees the weakness of education, the fact that there can never be a perfect match between educational input and output, only as a defect, only as something that needs to be addressed and overcome, but not also the very condition that makes education possible. Pressed for efficiency and reduction of risks, this version of higher education often strips out unpredictabilities, variabilities, diversities, and contestations. It focuses on managing and controlling, streamlining, optimizing. It establishes a set of views, beliefs, and truths about the world, and then expects all students to achieve outcomes and competencies based on those views alone, perhaps at their own pace, which we would falsely call personalization. I really appreciated Stephen's perspective on personalization and personal learning yesterday. I think that really captured an important piece of this. All of this is creating an increasingly untenable environment for the pleasure of learning, the transformative potential of education, the liberation that comes from viewing education as a practice of freedom, which is a term that Bell Hooks writes about, rather than a practice of calculating and assessing value. Hooks said, education as a practice of freedom affirms healthy self-esteem in students as it promotes their capacity to be aware and live consciously. This is a risky proposition, but it is at the heart of education for social good, not just individual good. So, we are at Campus Technology. What role does technology play in all this? And what does it tell us about our view of education? I look around at the technology being sold to higher education. I see a lot of offers of reduction of risks, words like quick, easy, simple, efficient, decontextualize, individually minded focus on learning as the ultimate value, learnification. Few questions of what and for what of education in these technologies. I saw one company's white paper that said, we also enable self-directed learning as the student knowledge profile quickly and clearly shows students and their teachers where the knowledge gaps are and how to fill them. In essence, the technologies for higher education are being focused on a march toward compliance. And I'm going to share with you, and I thank you, Gardner, for allowing me to use this, Gardner Campbell's delightful and thoughtful hierarchy of student engagement. Now, Gardner himself, so there's a great video of Gardner giving a talk about this taxonomy. Gardner himself admits on this video that his hierarchy is blissfully not supported by research, but neither is Bloom's taxonomy, so it's okay. However, knowing Gardner, this is based on years of professional judgment of one of the most impactful educators I've had the opportunity to know. And professional judgment in educators is so undervalued in our educational system, and it shouldn't be. So at the bottom of this taxonomy of student engagement is compliance. Gardner defines it as doing what you're told. We're becoming really good at this with technology. in large part because technologies have the affordances that center around compliance. So specifically, digital environments are seen as sites of great promise because of the opportunities they can provide for collecting data on learners. Online learning environments are increasingly designed and deployed with the production of such data in mind. Analytics are premised on the assumption that what can be tracked in relation to educational activity is also valuable in terms of understanding learning. And tracking and interpreting digital behaviors is the methodology that makes sense for the age of accountability. One of Gardner's cautions about the compliance focus, whether technologically mediated or not, is that it sets us in a relationship where we have to specify things to an nth degree. We have to set these really clear expectations for what can be measured and then measure against them so that we can show compliance. Students in turn will comply or maybe pretend to comply or maybe not comply if they reject it. And it creates this really transactional approach between faculty and students. It's performative. This push towards compliance in education is one of the reasons why my colleague Jen Ross, who's at the University of Edinburgh, and I came up with the term not yetness. And it's one that we've been talking about and writing about for a couple of years now. This came out of a book that a colleague of ours edited, George Valenciano's. I'm blanking on the name of the book. I have a chapter in it, so somebody go find it. But in the introduction to the book, George writes that one of the key features of emerging technologies is that they are not yet fully understood and they're not yet fully researched. And Jen and I really latched onto this idea and talked about the importance of that not yetness. The fact that emerging technologies aren't yet fully understood and aren't yet fully researched is that actually something of great value to us, that we should embrace that. We should reject the compliance focus that will almost always become attached to the technologies. Some technologies are designed for compliance, like proctoring programs and many LMSs, but others that start off kind of acknowledging a more complex relationship between students and educators eventually end up kind of being pushed towards compliance. And not yetness is about embracing of complexity and rejecting that notion. All the risk that is entailed in complexity is fundamental to education. Not yetness helps us to combat technological implementations that severely limit what we can do, what students can do. It resists the notion of compliance. It makes space for experimentation, for play, for uncertainty, for risk, and for forgiveness. Complexity is an important idea here. Complexity does not work with compliance. Compliance tries to put everyone in the same bucket. Conformity, stand in line, do as you're told. Complexity invites us to understand that the many processes and activities that shape the world we inhabit are open, recursive, organic, nonlinear, and emergent. It invites us to be skeptical of mechanistic and reductionistic explanations, which assume that these processes and activities are linear, deterministic, and or predictable, and therefore that they can be controlled, at least in principle. If we can accept that the world is complex, and I think most of us do, that education is complex, and I think most of us do, why are so many of our technologies about compliance? Instead, we need practices that acknowledge and work with the complexity. I would say practices and tools, technologies, that acknowledge and work with the complexity to help us stay open to what might be genuinely surprising about what happens when learning and teaching meet emerging technologies. In this sense, our focus as educators on emergent situations where complexity gives rise to new properties and behaviors that are not contained in the essence of the constituent elements or able to be predicted from a knowledge of initial conditions. So what's next on GC's taxonomy? Well, let me stop down for a second and say, why did I pick Gardner's taxonomy for this, for student engagement for this in the first place? I think it's because he is one of the most authoritative speakers about the possibilities of teaching and learning and what role tech can play. And I think his taxonomy theorizes the special sauce of education. The closer we get to the top, the more special and meaningful and transformative education can be. So, above compliance, what is next? Interest. So what makes something interesting? And we're not just talking about something that grabs attention, although that's important. We're not just talking about things that spark curiosity, it's very important. I think what we're also talking about is not just interests, but what is in these students' interests. So not just these students' interests, but what is in the students' interests. So recently I was listening to a talk from one of our Bread Loaf Teachers Network teachers. So Bread Loaf is a graduate school of English that Middlebury has. Middlebury is my school. Many of the attendees of Bread Loaf School of English are K through 12 teachers. Many are community college teachers. So there's a strong emphasis not just on the typical stuff of graduate English education, Shakespeare and Milton and writing good papers, but also on pedagogy. And I see some amazing things come out of the Bread Loaf Teachers Network. These people truly care deeply about learning and teaching. So this teacher who was speaking is a first-year and developmental English professor at a community college. She tells the story of how she decided, unlike everybody else in her department, to focus her developmental English class not on grammar and the structure of writing a good paper, but to actually have the students write papers on engaging with social issues in their communities, and to write a paper on those social issues after having engaged with people who were facing those social issues. I actually got really emotional when I heard, she showed a video of a veteran in her class who had been homeless at some point and now was working his way through community college, talking about writing a paper about homelessness and veterans in his community. It wasn't just interesting to him, it was of interest to him. It was the connection of something deep and meaningful and ongoing for him as a person who had experienced this himself. What role can technology and digital play in this engagement piece? Well, I think of courses like FoodWorks, which is loosely modeled off of thought vectors and DS 106 and some of the other kind of open courses that you've heard talk about. So FoodWorks is a course at Middlebury where the students go to different sites. They do internships in 3 different states. And while they're doing those, and these internships are around food justice and food systems. And while they're doing those internships, each of the students has their own domain that they use to represent their experiences during their internship. So there's a central site that aggregates the work that the students are doing. So you can see that the student work comes into a central place. The students can share their work with each other, but they also have a deep ownership of that work. It's based on their experiences and the things that are of interest to them as they do their internships. I love seeing these examples. I wish we could click on each one of these and you could see the depth of the writing, the experiences, the reflection, the things that the students are talking about and thinking about as a result of having the chance to represent their work in this way. But as you can see, students are really taking hold of this. They're really creating things that they're proud of and things they're excited about. And I think that's really important. That's a really important piece of this. The next part of the triangle is connection. And every time I think about this piece, I think about Vince Tinto's seminal work on why students leave college. It reminds us, the Tinto reminds us that connection is a key part of keeping students engaged in education. But as Gardner says, connection is difficult in education because it entails risk. But I think it's a risk worth taking. Here again, I think we're talking about the special sauce of education. I'll talk a little bit about John Dewey. John Dewey said that the central educational mechanism is participation, but not just individual participation, but participation in connecting to other human beings. A key argument that Dewey makes is that participation does not mean all of us agreeing on a worldview so we can engage in common activity, but that as we engage with others, as we connect with others toward cooperation, our worldviews change. connection. As worldviews change, we better understand ourselves and others and our world. And will the opportunity then not be for liberation? Connection is a key part of the liberatory power of education. Education as a practice of freedom is not a solitary activity. Liberation is a shared human struggle. So if the opportunity to connect deeply and meaningfully isn't central in your learning management system, or isn't possible in your personalized learning engine, toss it. So what's at the top of the taxonomy? What is, in Amy's view, and I think maybe Gardner's view, at the heart here? The thing that will keep a student not just learning to check off boxes, not just following the safe route, but risking it all for the possibility of better things ahead. Because Gardner Campbell said, education is about devoting some of the limited time we have as human beings to some kind of shared project. We don't have a ton of time on this earth. But love should be at the center of the educational experience of our institutions and of our daily work. I believe that. Cynthia Dillard said, in other words, becoming fully human is the very work of being human. This can be seen as an echo of Du Bois' 1989 spiritual striving about becoming more humane, more kind, more loving as human beings in relationship with one another and with all of life. A lot of people don't like it when I talk about love and education. It's not a particularly acceptable word in a lot of the circles that I run. You can talk about risk all day. I have some thoughts about what that might be. Maybe risk is a little bit of a gendered male concept. Love is a more gendered female concept. That could be one of the reasons. Love, caring, empathy are seen as female attributes. They're often devalued. But love is the orientation we need more of in education. It's the orientation that can move us from systematically decomplexifying education to embracing its richness. And the richness that our complex students and faculty and staff all bring to the thing we call education. Sean Michael Morris, who works with me at Middlebury, writes, love in pedagogical work is an orientation. It's a commitment to the personhood of learners, to their intersectionality, to their deep emotional backgrounds, to the authenticity of their lives. It's a decision to commit first to the community of learners and second to the material we've come to teach. When we speak about love in pedagogical work, we suspend our habitual talk of assessment, content, educational technology, plagiarism, compliance. We do not need to eliminate that talk, but when we return to it after orienting ourselves to the pedagogy of care, it is no longer habitual talk. It is considered discussion that often includes the learner. Love gives rise to the critical in this way, for it demands the decay of the unconsidered habit. He is such a good writer. Love is what pushes us away from the uncritical march to compliance. Love is what pushes us away from the uncritical move toward learnification. So what does love look like in education? I think it could probably look like a lot of things. I'm going to put forward 4 things that I think it can look like. But again, I think love and education is a deeply personal thing. It might look very different for each of us. I think love is questionability. Just as we were just talking about, the notion of being willing to be critical about the things that we're doing, remaining alive in the questionability of things. I love that phrase. Love is questionability. It resists essentialism, which is treating everyone's experience as the same, because love is to understand each of us at the human level. Everything we do is value laden. The lens of love acknowledges power and identity, performance, bodies, cultures, biases, and how they play into every part of the educational process, and every research, and every sample, and every algorithm, and every interpretation of data. Love allows us to question every one of those things. Love is play. So, if you know me, you have probably seen these videos. I'm going to show them to you anyway because I love them. And I think that they do a really great job of helping us to think about the role of play and how it shows love. So a few years ago, I was getting ready to do a talk on night madness, and I just had this really strange idea. And I told my husband and my son, who was, I think he may have been 5 at the time, to go to the store and pick out 2 sets of the exact same Lego sets. And my son was like, okay, Mom, yeah. Very excited, Legos, this kid, awesome. So they go to the store, they go to Toys R Us, and they pick out 2 of the same Lego sets. Star Wars, much to my husband's pride and joy, 2 Star Wars Lego sets that are exactly the same. So they get home and I tell my son, okay, build the first set according to the instructions. And so as you can see, and there's no audio in the video, so don't worry about that. My good compliant child, which I think he was really just being compliant because I was filming. But my good compliant child does the job of putting the Legos together according to the rules. And he's sweet. You just love him. Follows the instructions. 5-year-olds and Legos follow the instructions. Can be a little taxing on them. Got frustrated. He asked for help quite a bit. That's okay. So he finished building the set. Again, I had to help him, but he finished building the set. And I took all out away. And then I gave him the second set. And I said, okay, now build the set any way you want. And of course, suspicious 6-year-old, 5-year-old, whatever he was, looks at me and goes, Mom, really? Any way I want? I was like, yeah. Any way you want. In fact, to prove it to you, I will take away the instructions. No instructions. Now, tricky mom, here I think he is going to try to build or replicate exactly what he did the first time, right? I'm thinking he's going to try to mimic and do what he had already done. But look what he does instead. So first of all, notice he's immediately talking, much more than he had been before. And he immediately starts playing. He's making those sounds. You know those sounds, right? Right? You can't hear them, but you know they're there. Right? The entire time, once those instructions were taken out, he played. I don't know what he created. It wasn't what the box had, but he played the entire time. Joy and excitement on his face. In Luca Marini's excellent hybrid pedagogy article on, this is a great title, Higher Education as the Bulwark of Uselessness, go check it out. He writes, we can liberate education by never renouncing the uselessness and playfulness that should characterize true learning. Whatever the forms that play assumes, be it on a stage or a musical instrument, with feathers or with an amateur, purposeless digital game we ourselves designed, developed, and shared, anything goes as long as it eludes the hegemonic criteria of market and productivity and preserves the voluntary, joyful nature of play. Adeline Coe, in another hybrid pedagogy article, writes, play is not frivolous. Why do we think it is? But capable of producing serious intellectual work, an activity that possesses deep political power. Contrary to our commonplace understandings of play, I argue that a thoughtful analysis of the political power of play is potentially one of the most fruitful areas for those of us who are interested in furthering Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. So love is play in education. As you can imagine, I would also say love is risk. And I won't spend a lot of time here, but the funny thing is, once we start to embrace love as risk and risk as love in education, risk doesn't have quite the averse feeling to it. It feels rather like the completion of ourselves and our work. It becomes the new way we understand ourselves and our students and the work that we do. Love is risk. And lastly, love is resistance. So this picture is from a video game I love. Anyone know? Portal, that's right. So in the game Portal, oh, I'm so glad there are some nerds like me in here. That's awesome. In the game, I'm sorry if that's offensive. You're not nerds. I'm nerd. Okay. In the game, human test subjects, lab rats, are encouraged to keep submitting to testing. And as you can see, they're told that robots will replace them if they don't continue to submit to the testing that they're supposed to do. It's sadly the kind of language we hear in education. And in some ways, it's a bastardization of the idea, any teacher who can be replaced by a robot should be. Because we have this really strange view of what teaching is anyway, really narrow view. So we have to resist this. I'm not talking about resisting change. There are many things to change in education. I'm not talking about refusing to participate. I'm not talking about going back to an idealized way of thinking about the world and the way things were. As we were talking about yesterday, Stephanie Coons, who's a sociologist in my field, writes about the way we never were. I think that's a really interesting idea to bring to education as well. I'm talking about having more conversations about what we actually value in education, what we should value in education, and what it means for students to walk away from our institutions with an education. Audre Lorde, who is an amazing feminist writer, once wrote, these words that I am using are the master's tool, but I must use them to speak to you. I think Audre understood that resistance might not always look like no. Resistance might not always look like a refusal to engage. I don't outrightly refuse to use an LMS. Well, sometimes I do. I don't outrightly refuse to work with people who work in an LMS, but I do refuse to let it dictate how I relate and work with my students. I refuse to stop at compliance. That is resistance. Resistance can and will start in a lot of places, within an LMS, from within our students, in the community colleges rather than at the elites. Think about that for a minute. Don't tamp that down. Love is in resistance. I love what Audre Waters, I love everything she said, honestly. If you don't read Hack Education, you have to. She brings a really important voice to our community. She talks about the importance of resistance and all these other things too, community, open networks, open content sharing, a place on or offline that isn't dictated by market forces, local expertise, local support, leveraging technology to connect local learners and local expertise to the rest of the world, care about students, human connections, wonder, intellectual serendipity, but mostly resistance. We have many opportunities for resistance to bring love and risk back into our educational environments. What kind of leadership do we need? What kind of role do we need to play in this resistance? I think about this all of the time. I am a senior administrator who preaches love and emergence and patience and complexity, and that doesn't always resonate with people in the room. I'm often met with huge skepticism about what exactly does that mean, especially from people who have adopted a control mentality or an orientation of scarcity that says, well, when you have something I don't, so everything's a zero-sum game. Complexity doesn't fit into that. I see mentalities that blame faculty or for not doing what we think they're supposed to do, rather than understanding the complex experiences of faculty and students in our systems. So I struggle with this all the time. I feel like it's something I think about every day. So I'm going to take a little bit of a note from a page from Kevin Gannon, who on Twitter, I think it's @tattooed professor. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. So Kevin Gannon wrote recently a post on his blog, his teaching manifesto, and it's fabulous. And I think he's been writing a couple things since then. I think he was just on the Teaching in Higher Education podcast. You should check that out too. And so I thought, you know what? I think I'm going to end today with my leadership manifesto that's built on the ideas that I talked about today. But there are things that I struggle with on a day-to-day basis, and I have to work through every day. So this is my leadership manifesto. 1, slow down. In the rush to innovate, to move fast, we end up ignoring critical work. Asking the questions, what are we doing? What are we actually doing here? Asking why? Asking for whom? Asking for what? Take the time to have meaningful conversations. 2, always listen and seek to understand. Thich Nhat Hanh, I don't know if I said his name right, wrote, the more you understand, the more you love. The more you love, the more you understand. These are two sides to one reality. The mind of love and the mind of understanding are the same. 3, question all technology. Don't blindly adopt. And question it in a way that asks, what are its assumptions? Technology is not neutral, friends. Every single technology we use is built on assumptions about who we are and what we are valued at. Number 4, tinker. Don't calcify because of support. Embrace the not yetness in what we do and be willing to take those risks, even when it means faculty sometimes looking at you and going, what was that? That's okay. There are no, 5. There are no such thing as best practices. There is only learning from others and trying to understand contexts better. 6, talk to people about this all the time. Don't let the dominant discourse in my group be about adopting and supporting technology, or those darn faculty, or how to change fast and thoughtlessly. 7, I think we're on 7. So many of the most exciting things happen when you put people in a room together, whether it's a virtual room or a face-to-face room, and you affirm them and you resource them and you care about them and you get out of their way. Do this more. And last, love. Unabashedly love. Stop worrying and love. Love even when it's hard, even when those colleagues make you a little crazy. Love even when you're not expected to love. Love because we need more love. I'm going to end with a quote from my favorite author, Anne Lamott. Love falls to the earth, rises from the ground, pulls around the afflicted. Love pulls people back to their feet. Bodies and souls are fed, bones and lives heal. New blades of grass grow from charred soil. The sun rises. That is the education I want. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you everyone for joining us this year. Be sure to follow the Campus Technology Conferences on social media year-round. Please look for the call for proposals for 2017 soon. And please mark your calendars for Campus Technology 2017, which will be held in Chicago at the McCormick Place Lakeside Center. Thank you.